everyone, and good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located in the country or around the world. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this Traffic Logix webinar series, Tools for Your Traffic Calming Toolbox. My name is Mark Roth. I'm the head of marketing here at Traffic Logix, and I'll be facilitating today's session and subsequent question and answer period. To give you a quick background on who we are at Traffic Logix, we're a leading manufacturer in the traffic calming industry with an ever-growing family of products, including modular vertical deflectors, radar feedback signs, and our new SafePace cloud system. We are proud as usual to host regular online education sessions just like this one in order to bring together the latest best practices and industry decision makers much like yourselves. So I'll just go over some housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded and will be circulated to all of you attendees for your reference right after the webinar. We're going to be asking for your feedback in a few interactive polls during the session, so please participate and share your feedback for the benefit of our larger audience. For those of you who will be receiving professional development hours for this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a quiz after the session, and then we will be awarding your credits shortly thereafter. There is a questions and answers box on the lower right of your screen to enter your questions and comments throughout the webinar series. At the conclusion of our session, we'll allow about 15 or 20 minutes to answer as many of those questions that you have as possible, and we'll make the remainder available on our website with the recording. So please allow me to introduce our presenter today, Mr. Tim Harpst, a well-respected expert in his field and also an incredible educator. Tim has served as the Salt Lake City Transportation Director for 25 years and is a professional engineer and certified professional traffic operations engineer. He's earned these accolades, obtaining a Bachelor of Science from Penn State and a Master's in Civil Engineering, specializing in transportation and traffic engineering from Virginia Tech. Tim was the former chairman of the Utah Engineers Council and international president of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and he currently sits on the board of directors of the Professional Transportation Certification Board, offering certifications in traffic operations and transportation planning. He also teaches at the University of Utah and Northwestern. And with that introduction, I am happy to hand over our microphone to Mr. Tim Harpst.
Thank you, Mark, and good day, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our traffic calming webinar. And I'd also like to thank WMH Engineering Consultants in San Jose, California, from whose offices we are broadcasting today's webinar. What you see on this slide are the topics we covered in part 1 of the webinar last November. We'll recap them in a minute, but first, let's do a quick poll so we can all get an idea of the types of traffic calming tools our audience currently uses the most. So everyone, please respond to the poll that is coming up on your screen. While the poll is being conducted, I'd like to mention that speed humps have traditionally been the most used and certainly the most requested traffic calming measure for a number of years. However, because they have to be driven over by all drivers, they are often seen as overly punitive by law-abiding drivers. And now that there are many more traffic calming tools available to us, such as the ones we will be talking about today, we may be seeing a wider variety of traffic calming devices being deployed in the future. You should now be seeing the poll results. And actually, because of my remote location, I am waiting for the poll results to come in via text. So much for high technology. So we can see that a lot of people are using speed humps, as we thought, as well as cushions, which is a very good substitute for speed humps, especially if you have streets with a lot of large vehicles that travel on it. So thank you all for participating in this poll. We will do one more poll a bit later. Now let's briefly review what was presented last November in part 1 of this webinar so we can refresh our memories and provide background for those who weren't able to participate then. We began by talking about the desire of the neighborhood residents and elected officials to see streets calmed because it is a personal safety issue, and it has social and quality of life implications that are very important to communities. We also talked about how if we as transportation professionals don't take action, residents will try to do our job for us, such as doing this. And we don't want to see inappropriate, illegal, and potentially unsafe attempts at traffic control, and neither does the public at large. We then discussed the most commonly requested tool, speed humps. They are very effective because they require traffic to slow to the speed limit to safely and comfortably negotiate them. However, as mentioned during our poll, speed humps are indiscriminate and penalize the non-speeding as well as speeding traveling public because everyone must drive over them. From there, we looked at variations of speed humps, namely speed tables and raised crosswalks. We discussed how speed are gentler on all, but especially large vehicles, and can be installed mid-block or cover an entire intersection. Raised crosswalks, which also are speed humps with a flat platform in the center designed for walking upon, add safety emphasis to heavily used mid-block crossings and can be used at intersections. Speed cushions are another variation of speed humps that allow wide-axle vehicles to travel in flat spacings between the cushions, thus avoiding overly harsh jolting from their typically stiff suspensions. Speed cushions are appropriate on streets frequented by large vehicles, such as fire truck routes and bus routes. We also discussed how speed humps, tables, cushions, and raised crosswalks can all be tested or installed permanently using rubber products such as the ones shown in these slides and available from Traffic Logix. We saw how bulb outs at intersections shorten the distance between pedestrians and the time that they are exposed to traffic when crossing streets. They also make pedestrians preparing to cross more visible to approaching drivers who tend to drive more slowly because of the narrower street at the intersection. Like bulb outs, entranceways and chokers also slow traffic by physically and visually narrowing the street. These treatments psychologically influence drivers to drive more slowly. Note how the choker shown on the right also incorporated a raised crosswalk. Chicanes, which are bulb outs located strategically along the sides of streets, control traffic speed by requiring drivers to meander laterally as they drive down a street, and in some cases, share a travel lane with oncoming traffic. And traffic circles calm traffic by requiring drivers to slow to negotiate around them. They also simplify the operation of intersections by reducing the number of potential conflict points, and can provide refuges for pedestrians as they cross a street. And aesthetically, they offer landscaping opportunities for a neighborhood. So that's a quick recap of part 1 of the webinar. Today we are going to talk about even more tools we can use to influence traffic speed. We will discuss these traffic calming tools followed by a question and answer session. If you have any questions you would like to ask, please enter them at any time. We will go over as many of them as time allows at the conclusion of this presentation. If we don't get to all of them, don't worry. As Mark said, we will post all the questions and answers on the Traffic Logix website shortly after the webinar. Let's begin with driver feedback signs, which are electronic signs equipped with radar that display actual vehicle speed to oncoming drivers. They are educational by very effectively reminding drivers of their speed. They physically show residents that you have taken action on their expressed concerns about speeding on their street, and they operate 24/7. It is important that these devices are compliant with the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices guidelines, especially when they assist police enforcement, and to ensure that the device does not induce driver distraction from inappropriate light brightness or flash rate. Although the basic function of radar signs is to provide drivers with feedback as to their actual speed, these signs can be capable of much more. Basic models, such as the Traffic Logix Safe Pace 100 shown here, display the speed of all approaching drivers. Intermediate level radar signs, such as these, can be programmed to display approaching driver speeds only if they are driving within a programmed speed range. This is done to provide emphasis to speeding drivers because drivers traveling at acceptable speeds do not activate the sign. These signs can also be used to display the current speed limit on streets where variable speed limits are used, such as at school zones and work sites. Advanced radar signs are available in various sizes and are capable of displaying dynamic messaging using text, graphics, and animation. Programmed messages can include moving arrows and scrolling, as well as be displayed in multiple rotations. Many of these signs can also be used in portrait and landscape display mode. Some driver feedback signs, including all of the safe pace signs just shown, are capable of performing speed and volume studies. Data is recorded and can be retrieved at the sign, or remotely via laptop in the field, or by PC in the office. These signs are capable of being managed remotely, such that all programming can be performed on multiple signs efficiently, conveniently, and safely from an office environment. Customizable reports can also be generated to evaluate the level of speeding on a street, determine the effectiveness of the sign in reducing speeding, shown in reports, and even broadcast live at meetings. Let's now take a minute to conduct our second poll so we can all get an idea of how many of our audience collect traffic volume and speed data. Please respond yes or no to the poll that is now on your screen. Does your city collect and/or analyze traffic volume and speed data? There are several great things about using radar feedback signs that collect data as well as display speeds. First, there is no need to expend additional resources to send someone out to collect that data. The data is collected safely and automatically without exposing a technician to traffic to set out and pick up counter equipment. And the data is available anytime, so you can report back to the neighborhood or elected officials as to exactly what is happening on their street. It certainly seems like the great majority of those participating in today's webinar do collect and analyze traffic volume and speed data, which is very good, since that gives us a lot of information as to where the problems are, what locations don't really have problems, and being able to report back to the public on any actions that we have taken. Now let's continue with more traffic calming tools and methods for you to consider using. Many driver feedback signs can be solar powered, which simplifies installation and increases options for sign location. It also provides portability for use in traffic calming programs that regularly rotate driver feedback signs among neighborhoods. Using driver feedback signs in conjunction with school zones is ideal in that it provides emphasis to drivers of the temporarily reduced speed condition and can aid enforcement. Radar speed signs can also be mounted on a trailer. They fit in a regular street parking space and are typically battery or solar powered. Their transportability is a big benefit, and they are very effective in helping police do targeted speed education as well as enforcement. Like pole-mounted driver feedback signs, they are a good public relations tool and can provide data collection. Some manufacturers also offer trailer hitch mounting capability. This allows deployment without needing a trailer, but obviously requires the vehicle to be parked throughout the time the radar feedback sign is being operated. Let's turn our attention to the use of edge lines and bike lane markings. Their use physically and psychologically narrows the driving lane. This lowers the comfortable driving speed. In this example, a two-lane, one-way street was converted to a single lane with edge lines and a bike lane. Adding marked bike lanes improves the safety and usability of the street for cyclists. This photo shows the conversion of a two-lane in each direction street to a single lane in each direction street, which allowed the addition of much-needed bike lanes and provided parking on one side of the street which previously had no parking. This conversion was the result of a complete streets evaluation effort which worked with the residential neighborhood, a budding university, and adjoining business district to determine deficiencies and identify the best use of the available pavement width to improve conditions for all user groups. Note how the edge lines help visually narrow the street from a driver's point of view despite the open street width. Bike boulevards are local, usually residential streets that are signed and marked to emphasize to all users that bicyclists are not only welcome, but encouraged to use the street. Even though there might not be sufficient width to paint dedicated bike lanes, various traffic controls and advisory signs are used to alert drivers that they will likely encounter bicyclists and need to drive slowly and attentively. It's best if the selected street is a single lane in each direction, low-volume street, that connects land uses that are attractive to cyclists, such as parks and employment centers. Implementation can be achieved in a minimalist manner, such as shown here, by painting large-scale bike symbols on the travel lane. And it's always a good idea to consider lowering the speed limit to a more bike-friendly 20 miles per hour. A more common and intermediate level treatment for bike boulevards, such as the one shown in this photo, can incorporate not only bicycle symbols and speed limit signage, but also the addition of dedicated bike lanes, chicanes, or even speed humps. More frequent use of all-way stop sign controls can also be used to influence non-local traffic to use more appropriate nearby streets. A more advanced development of a bicycle boulevard could use toucan signals, which aid bicyclists and pedestrians in crossing key or busy streets, but not assist automobiles in crossing. They may even force drivers to turn off the street, as shown in this photo, thus helping reduce the auto traffic volume on the bicycle boulevard. Bicycle boulevards improve conditions for non-auto roadway users while effectively calming auto speeds. Green shared lane markings consist of a 4-foot to 6-foot wide solid green stripe in the center of a traffic lane. The green stripe is supplemented by white bike symbols and chevrons spaced about 100 feet apart. These are recommended for streets where bicycling is encouraged, but there is insufficient street width to provide dedicated bike lanes. They not only alert drivers to the presence of bicycles, but also encourage the bicyclists to take command of the traffic lane because there is insufficient width to allow drivers to safely pass the cyclist in the same lane. In this photo, a green shared lane treatment was used where a concrete retaining wall exists on the right side of a narrow travel lane and another narrow travel lane is on the left side. This slide shows the use of a green shared lane on a normal width travel lane, but one shouldered by a raised curb on one side and a non-bike friendly rumble strip on the other side where light rail tracks exist. Green shared lane treatments calm streets and a lower speed limit is typically encouraged. They can work well in a downtown area where travel speeds are usually low and narrow travel lanes are commonly found. Crosswalk approach bars consist of 5 or 6 horizontal bars in traffic lanes placed on the approach to crosswalks. They are particularly effective in helping motorists identify and slow down in advance of difficult-to-see mid-block crossings. They can be especially helpful on multi-lane streets with speed limits of 30 miles per hour or greater, but are appropriate at any mid-block location where pedestrian safety is a concern. There are no real negatives to their use, but they do require periodic maintenance. They are also a good way to use remnants of pavement marking tape that might otherwise be thrown away. Wide open streets can be narrowed physically and psychologically with the addition of medians. Planting trees in medians and open spaces along both sides of the street can help develop a tree canopy over time. Tree types that grow long branches should be selected to encourage development of a canopy over the street. Medians and tree canopies influence slower driving and add to the character, aesthetics, and value of the abutting properties. Neighborhood residents need to see that traffic laws, especially speed limits, are being enforced. Enforcement resources exist within every police department, and transportation professionals can provide them input on where speed enforcement is needed. Enforcement is also a source of revenue, which you might be able to convince your elected leadership to use to fund traffic calming measures. Enforcement can be a good public relations tool, but care should be taken to ensure that it isn't overly punitive to the point of public criticism. Let's always keep in mind that studies consistently show that 50% of speeding in neighborhoods is done by abutting residents. It is always important to include public education in any traffic calming program or effort. The use of pamphlets is a simple, inexpensive way to accomplish this. They are easy to create, print, distribute, and explain what behavior is desired and what resources are available. They can also be incorporated into your traffic calming website. Many municipalities who already have created pamphlets are generally willing to allow you to use theirs as a model in crafting one suitable for your community. Although you might not want to see anyone go to this extent in trying to calm streets, there are a number of outside-the-box measures that you can consider trying. Let's take a look at some. You can start a neighborhood speed watch program in which your community officially offers a radar gun to residents so they can get a better idea of actual speeds on their street. This should be done in cooperation with police, include training on use of the radar gun, and require temporary signing where the gun is deployed to alert drivers that it is a community-sanctioned neighborhood effort and not a police operation issuing citations. This program educates residents of the actual extent of the problem and gets their buy-in to help solve the problem. Or you can start a neighborhood pace car program in which abutting residents sign an agreement to not speed. They display pace car logos, such as the bumper sticker shown here, on their cars to help educate other drivers. As they drive down the street, their vehicles serve as mobile speed controls because drivers wishing to speed can't generally pass on a local street. You can install orange flag holders at busy crosswalks and stock flags for pedestrians to use while crossing to give them more visibility to drivers. Or better yet, consider starting an Adopt a Crosswalk program in which residents agree to keep small canisters that you install at each end of a crosswalk stocked with orange flags that they purchase. Try providing stickers with traffic calming messages to residents for display on their garbage and recycle cans. This can provide a weekly reminder to drivers of the speed limit and is an easy, inexpensive way to show residents you are being responsive. You can have banners made that contain traffic calming messages. These can be displayed on street light or utility poles and periodically rotated from neighborhood to neighborhood. This is a medium cost effort in that banner holders need to be purchased and installed on the poles. A less expensive version of a streetlight pole banner program is one using campaign lawn signs. It is fairly inexpensive to buy blank signs and holders. These can be given to elementary school classes from the neighborhood wanting traffic calming. The class then makes a project out of coloring traffic calming messages on the signs and displaying them in their front lawns. My personal favorite was a drawing of a dog by a talented young boy who also wrote on the sign, "Slow down. Please don't run over my dog." There are many ways to help educate, encourage, and even require the public to drive safely and within the speed limit. All we have to do is put our thinking caps on, like the creator of this pavement message did. And now it's time for the question and answer portion of our webinar. Mark, what type of questions have we been receiving from our audience?
Thank you, Tim. So just a reminder to everybody that on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar screen, you should have a questions box that you can go to at any time and enter a question for Tim to answer. Alternatively, if you're having any kind of technical issues, you can email them to marketing@trafficlogix.com and we will address them as well. So we have a couple of questions coming in already. One, Tim says that the problem with speed limit signs and other speed devices is that speed limits are not set by traffic engineers, but by local officials who think that local residents are better traffic engineers than their professional staff, and they usually set them too low. What do you have to comment on that?
Wow, that's quite a question, almost a commentary by itself. Speed limits are established in, I would say, the majority of locations by the traffic engineers. They might have some heavy influence by the elected officials. In some cases, the elected officials do have the ability to set those speed limits, and in other communities, it's actually the police enforcement that makes the decision. One of the things that we as transportation professionals need to consider is helping educate the elected officials and even our constituents who might be asking for lower speed limits by talking to them about some of the problems that having too low of a speed limit can cause, such as people driving faster because they know it's safe, because people generally will drive at a speed at which they're comfortable, and that includes looking at all the things in their surrounding, the width of the street, how open it is, is it straight or hilly, those sorts of things. And so it's really incumbent on us to help educate all of our people who might want to influence the speed limit signs and show them some of the problems that could be created. And it might be that we find that drivers might start ignoring other signs and other traffic controls we have out there. So you might want to look at some examples in your community where if this has happened, and go out and measure the speeds, take a look at your crash history and see if there have been any changes due to that, and start a bit of educational program.
Thanks, Tim. Question, are the crosswalk approach bars in the MUTCD, or is there any other guidebook available?
They are not specifically in the MUTCD. They have been used extensively in Europe, and there are different ways to install these. There are different patterns that can be used. I've seen them with 4 bars, 5 bars, 6 bars. I see them at different spacings and different distances from the actual crosswalk. One of the things I would suggest to anyone desiring to use these is to take into consideration the speed of the roadway, because the faster the speed limit, the longer the distance has to be back from the crosswalk that you start putting the crossbars, and the larger the spacing you need between each of them. So one way to do this is use pavement marking tape, and before installing them, literally lay them out on a street and drive down that street several times to see if it gives you enough notice and advance warning that you have the ability to see these advance bars, understand there's a crosswalk up ahead, and have the ability to react and slow down and stop if necessary.
Thanks, Tim. Is there any kind of database regarding the various costs and effectiveness of all of these different traffic calming devices?
I'm not aware of any specific databases on costs. As you might imagine, costs can vary depending on the cities that you live in. Much of this material, however, is very common. We're using paint, we're using markings, we're using signage and electronic signs, so it's not anything that's too unusual. The ones that I've just mentioned are relatively inexpensive. Where traffic calming tends to get very pricey is if we start doing physical changes to the road, such as building bulb outs at intersections or chicanes at mid-block locations.
Another question here, what is the most effective method of speed control on snow-covered streets and roadways?
Well, believe it or not, speed humps work in snow country. I installed many of them in Salt Lake City when I was the transportation director there. One of the things we did, however, is we only installed concrete speed humps. And the reason for that is in the construction process, you can build a scree and get the perfect profile that you want built because of the scree going over the concrete. If you are building them out of asphalt, they are very difficult to get that profile. The other reason for concrete is they help identify the location, especially if they are on an asphalt street, because you can see the difference in the color and texture of the pavement. And if you sign them properly, when it's snowing out and you talk to the snowplow drivers and they know where these are, they can drive over them a little bit slower than normal, but they do not, even if you have a bare pavement policy where the blade scrapes the pavement, they do not destroy the pavement of the hump, and they work quite well. So that is the most effective speed reducing traffic calming device out there, obviously.
Great. What is the typical street volume that would qualify for a bike boulevard?
Well, you know, that's really up to you. For all of these, the use of all these traffic control devices, my recommendation is that you always have some policies and procedures in place, because once you install a traffic calming device, word gets out pretty quickly, and some people will be knocking on your door asking for those on their street, and you need to have whatever criteria you believe is a good criteria before installing these. For bicycle boulevards, I would really stress that you consider the following. First, you want to make sure it's a local residential street. That guarantees that you're in a low automobile volume street condition, because the goal here is not to take a lot of traffic volume off of the street, but to find a street that has a fairly low volume and just have those drivers drive within the speed limit and recognize that they're going to see a lot more cyclists than they might normally see. The second criteria is to make sure the bicycle boulevard location makes sense for your community. If it's not in a location that connects generators of any kind of traffic, people and bicyclists just aren't going to use it. Bicyclists, just like drivers, want to take pretty much the most direct route from where they are to where they want to go. And so if you have bicycle boulevards on local streets that connect, say, a downtown center or a regional park or a neighborhood business neighborhood, that would be ideal.
Great. What are your thoughts on the use of centerline striping in residential areas? Do they create the perception of a more major street that might encourage higher speeds, or the perception of a narrower road which encourages lower speeds?
In general, because I have to stress that every situation is different. Even if one street looks identical to another street, you might have a totally different situation with different volumes of traffic, different percentages of parking on the street curbside, etc., and they all influence what happens on that street. But in general, I am not a big fan of using centerline striping by itself. If you use it in conjunction with an edge line or edge lines that develop bike lane lines, that makes a big difference, and it makes it look more natural, and it helps develop exactly where you want the cars to go and where the bicyclists should be.
Thank you, Tim. I believe the safe pace signs, as well as others, have what is called a stealth mode. So when should this stealth mode be used appropriately?
The stealth mode is a good feature in terms of if you have a location where maybe there's a lot of volume of traffic and you don't want that sign activated and flashing all the time. Because if you don't use the stealth mode, every car that goes by there will activate it in some way and either show the speed that the driver is going or display a message of some kind. So if there's a higher volume of traffic, or if you're getting complaints from people that this thing's always flashing, or maybe you're even having some issues with the durability of the power source, if you're using a battery, or maybe you've got an older solar power connection, if you can go into the stealth mode, then what you're doing is you're only activating that sign when someone is speeding beyond the speed that you think they should be going.
Here's an interesting question. What is your experience with jurisdictions being reluctant to use speed humps or bumps because of liability for causing accidents to very high-speed drivers and damage to vehicle suspension if speeds are too high and damage does result?
what I have seen is there are communities that have decided not to use speed humps or curtail the use of them because they've gotten complaints. And that's one of the issues we face with almost all traffic calming devices. You often find that neighborhoods are divided, that the public, half of it likes it and half of it doesn't. But if the communities decide that for whatever reason they don't want to have speed humps, well, then you use other traffic control devices. If the speed hump is properly designed, in other words, if it has the profile that makes sense, and there are some guidelines out there, such as the Institute of Transportation Engineers has pretty good guidelines on what that profile should look like. There is no need to be overly concerned about either damage to vehicles or causing crashes, because it's really incumbent on the drivers to drive within a speed limit, to drive safely, and they have to drive safely regardless of the posted speed limit. So in other words, it's not just the speed that we post out there. If something is out there in the road, and maybe it's a speed hump or maybe it's a ball that is rolling across the street, it's really up to the driver to always maintain control of their vehicle and not cause crashes. So if a crash should occur, it's really not the liability of the community in the great majority of cases.
Thanks, Tim. What is the minimum width for lane narrowing recommended as a traffic calming measure? What kind of speed reduction could be expected from lane narrowing?
A very good question. Part of it depends on the roadway classification and how it's being used. If you're talking about a residential street that really only has one lane in each direction, you probably don't even have center line striping on it, and so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're talking about a collector street, you're starting to see more traffic volume. You're starting to need to put down a center line, or maybe it's a multi-lane street. You need to take into account the volume of traffic and the type of traffic. Are there a lot of buses or large trucks intermixed with this? What the question to answer or ask yourself is, what is the likelihood that you're going to have two large vehicles approaching each other trying to get down the street? Another aspect of this is, I would say 10 feet is a great traffic lane width. Studies have shown in the last few years that there is no increase in car crashes as a result of reducing street lane widths from 12 and 11 feet down to 10 feet in urban areas with speeds of 30 miles an hour or lower. So you can get away with that easily. If you start going below 10 feet, then the difficulty you run into is not necessarily the width of a vehicle like a bus, but it's more of the large mirrors on both sides of that vehicle. And when you look at the outside of the mirror distance to the outside of the other mirror, you're starting to go beyond or that 9-foot area if you're trying to get away with 9-foot lanes. So 10 feet is typically the minimum that I would recommend.
Here's an interesting question. So one of our attendees said the options that you suggested, all great. The issue, though, with almost everyone generally is that it requires a permit of some kind. So how or what is the best way to approach this issue, generally speaking?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand that question fully. If it's a local government, they would not require a permit to install traffic calming devices. So I'm not quite sure what would be meant there. If we're talking about a planned unit development, those are privately owned streets, and there are usually homeowners associations that make decisions on what types of controls they put on their internal street system.
All right, can you explain or address the 85% rule regarding traffic speed?
Well, in general, what history has shown us is traffic engineers can only control about 85% of the driving public with respect to speed. So when we post a speed limit and we look at the speed at which all the cars are traveling down that street, if we do it properly, about 85% of the cars going down that street are traveling at or below the posted speed limit. And if we do this, we've also found that that will result in the fewest numbers of crashes, so it's the safest speed for that particular street. I mentioned earlier that most of us drive at what we feel is comfortable. If you think about yourself behind the steering wheel of a car, you're not constantly looking at your speedometer. You're looking at what's going on out in front of you, and you're driving at a speed at which you're feeling comfortable and that you can stop or control your car or slow your vehicle if needed. And so the 85% rule is actually resulting in what should be the safest speed for that particular street.
Thanks, Tim. Here's an interesting one for your comment about symbols and some of the things that we showed near the end of the session. So throughout the years of traffic engineering, it is known to all of us that there is great creativity of the use of symbols for messaging. Because the use of symbols and words has morphed throughout different states and different cities, there's a large need for some kind of conformity to maintain these symbols and so that they do not create confusion, since that confusion would likely actually delay responses from drivers instead of the opposite effect. What are your thoughts?
Yes, that's a good point. Maybe looking at it from a historical standpoint, European countries started the use of symbols, particularly on signs, way before other countries, and that's because there are so many small countries very close to each other with so many different languages being spoken that word messages weren't necessarily getting across to everyone. And the symbol messages are something that virtually everyone can understand if they're done properly and clearly. And studies have shown that using symbols is far superior than using word messages. They're understood by people that speak different languages, plus they're very quickly understood because it's so visual as opposed to needing to read a series of words. The Manual and Uniform Traffic Control Devices has a tried and true method of testing and evaluating and then approving certain symbols for signs, and they recommend also the size of the sign, the color of the background, and the type of design itself. If there are some transportation professionals who would like to try something a little different, they think they've got a better idea, there is a method where they can simply apply to the Federal Highway Administration, which controls the MUTCD, for approval to test. And what that means is your request goes to a panel of professionals who can deliberate on your concept, and they will look at things such as, is this going to cause any potential safety problem if people don't understand what it is, or do we think this is a pretty good idea to at least see if it works? And they'll come back and give you approval, or maybe an approval with some suggestions on how to go about doing your testing. And then you can proceed, understanding that it is a test, and share those results. and eventually another committee within the MUTCD family will come out and evaluate that, and it might turn out to become a new standard or guideline.
Interesting answer, and it's an interesting question. So we'll deal with one more, and then I just want to thank everybody. Your questions have been flowing in, and what we'll do is, as I said, we will take these questions and answer them all offline with Tim and our experts here, and we'll post them with the recording in a few days. So there's been a few questions, Tim, to finish off our question and answer period, all about the impact on emergency vehicles. So response times, and all of those related issues to emergency vehicles and traffic calming.
Okay, one of the best things to do is to sit down with your fire department in particular, but also your police department, and talk to them about saying you've got a concept for doing speed humps or speed controls, and you might be considering some devices that might have an impact on the vehicles going through there, and ask them to participate in some testing. One way I did this was I went to a remote location at our city airport, laid out some speed humps and speed cushions, and had the fire department bring out all the different types of vehicles they use, including ambulances, and test these devices and brought them into the picture. They become part of a team that then says, yes, there is a speeding problem and how can we help solve it? And we were able to get full support out of our police and fire departments on deployment of speed humps and speed cushions. So the speed cushion, first of all, is a great tool because it really takes away most of the issues for the large vehicles, so the buses that use the public streets, the garbage collection and recycling trucks, and also the fire response apparatus. So if you bring them into the fold, make them part of the team and help you work towards solving the problem, I think you'll find that they can buy into the whole program. Some of the things that you can consider doing in addition to that is looking at certain streets where maybe they have a high response rate. So for example, on the street that the fire station is located on is off limits for speed humps. Maybe for several blocks until you get to the collector and primary streets that they tend to drive the most to get out to different areas in their coverage zone, take those off of the eligibility list for speed humps, which brings up a broader suggestion, which is as you develop a traffic calming program and you start adding traffic calming tools like we've talked about for the last 2 webinars, is to identify any streets or street types or speeds at which certain tools would not be eligible. So for example, you do not want to put a speed hump on an arterial street. So just like talking to the fire department about not putting them on the streets that they travel the most, you can all agree on that and then look at other traffic calming devices as well. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is thank you all for participating and turn the time back to Mark for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Tim, so much on behalf of all of us at Traffic Logix, as well as thank you to everyone who's joined us for this very robust and interesting hour, our second in the series of webinars on traffic calming best practices. So just to remind everybody that we have recorded the session and we will be contacting each of you with the link to download the complete recording, as well as we will be posting the questions and answers transcribed from this session on a blog entry on our website at trafficlogix.com. For those of you looking for your professional development hour credits, you'll be getting a quiz after this session, and just fill out that quiz, with hopefully the right answers, and then we will award your credits shortly thereafter. And if there's anything else that you need from us or from Tim, Traffic Logix, we can be contacted at marketing@trafficlogix.com, and we'll get back to you in a very short time. So thank you all again for joining us from wherever you're joining us from. Thanks again, Tim, and thank you for everybody for joining. Have a wonderful afternoon.